What if everything you thought you knew about one of comedy's greatest legends was just an act? George Carlin built his career on brutal honesty, but the reality behind closed doors was darker than anything he ever said on stage. Most people remember Carlin as the fearless comic who said what everyone else was too scared to say, the guy who got arrested for his infamous 7 dirty words routine, the counterculture hero who challenged authority and made millions laugh. But that image barely scratches the surface of who George Carlin really was. Behind the jokes and rebellion was a man fighting demons that would eventually consume him. Born in 1937 in New York City, Carlin's childhood reads like something out of a nightmare. His father, Patrick, was violent, terrifying, and completely unpredictable. Mary, his mother, watched helplessly as Patrick targeted their older son, knowing George would be next. One night, she made a decision that changed everything. She gathered her boys, escaped through the fire escape while Patrick slept, and never looked back. But for young George, the nightmare was just beginning. His father's absence didn't bring peace. When George was 8, Patrick passed, and the family fell apart. His relationship with his mother deteriorated fast. Mary became cold, critical, impossible to please. George spent his childhood running away from home, lighting up cigarettes, and getting expelled from school after school. Eventually, he just stopped going altogether. He was a kid lost in the world, with no direction and no idea where he belonged. Desperate for structure, Carlin joined the Air Force. Big mistake. 3 court-martials in just a few years. He fell asleep during guard duty on a simulated mission, blatantly disobeyed orders, and disrespected a non-commissioned officer. After 3 years of chaos, they cut him loose. Most people would have seen this as rock bottom, but Carlin was just getting started. Despite all the rebellion, Carlin had been obsessing with comedy since he was a kid. He idolized Danny Kaye and dreamed of making people laugh. In 1959, he teamed up with Jack Burns to form a comedy duo that started gaining traction. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. The George Carlin performing on stage in the early 60s wasn't the George Carlin the world would come to know. He was clean-cut, wholesome, respectable. He wore suits, kept his hair short, and told jokes that wouldn't offend your grandmother. It was all a performance. Deep down, Carlin knew it. During a show in Dayton, Ohio, Carlin spotted a gorgeous woman hanging around the bar. Her name was Brenda Hasbrook, and she was working as a waitress. Less than a year later, they were married. In 1963, they welcomed their daughter, Kelly, and from the outside, everything looked perfect. Carlin's solo career was taking off. He was making regular appearances on variety shows, and the money was rolling in. But cracks were already forming. Carlin loved being a dad. He'd spend hours with Kelly, introducing her to new music, watching animal shows, and doing all the voices. But he also did something most parents would never dream of doing. He rolled papers right in front of her. He had her help mix ingredients into what he called Daddy's spiced cakes. By the time Kelly was old enough to understand, she'd been exposed to a world no child should ever see. Carlin didn't hide his habits from his family, and that openness would come back to haunt everyone. In the early 1960s, Carlin and Burns went to see Lenny Bruce perform. Bruce was the original shock comic who talked openly about substance use, profanity, and everything polite society swept under the rug. For Carlin, it wasn't just a great show, it was a revelation. He saw exactly what he wanted to become, and he witnessed the price that came with it. In December 1962, Carlin sat in a Chicago nightclub watching Bruce perform when officers stormed in and arrested him for obscenity. They started questioning audience members, demanding identification. When they got to Carlin, he looked them dead in the eye and said he didn't believe in government-issued IDs. They didn't find that funny. Carlin got detained right alongside Lenny Bruce, and his path was set. He was done playing it safe. By 1968, Carlin had reached massive success. His first comedy album dropped, he was guest host in The Tonight Show, and he landed a role on Away We Go. He had a home in Beverly Hills and enough money to live comfortably. But while Carlin was riding high, Brenda was spiraling inward. She spent most days alone with Kelly, and the isolation was eating her alive. She started drinking heavily and constantly. Carlin worried enough to refuse letting her get a pilot's license, terrified she'd hurt herself or someone else. But he didn't stop his own habits. That double standard would tear him apart. Everything changed in 1969. After years of sticking mostly to lighter substances, Carlin dropped a tab of something much harder, and it completely altered his perspective. Kelly later said he called it a values changer. He looked at his life and realized he was living a lie. The clean-cut comedian wasn't who he really was, so he decided to stop pretending. Carlin grew out his hair and beard, got his ears pierced, ditched the suits for ripped jeans and ratty shirts, and completely overhauled his comedy routine. He started talking about politics, religion, substances, and everything the establishment wanted him to avoid. It was the boldest move of his career, and it nearly destroyed him. His regular audience felt betrayed. Ticket sales plummeted 90% almost overnight. People whispered he made the biggest mistake of his life. But Carlin didn't back down. He hired a new management team, started over in smaller clubs with younger crowds, and slowly rebuilt his career from scratch. 2 years later, it paid off. His album FM and AM came out, and it was genius. The AM side featured his old, clean comedy. The FM side showcased his new, edgier material. It was the perfect bridge, and mainstream audiences finally understood. Carlin was back on top, but he wasn't done pushing boundaries. Around this time, Carlin perfected the routine that would define his legacy: the 7 dirty words. He brazenly listed off the profanities you couldn't say as a public figure, the ones that would infect your soul and keep the country from winning the war. On July 21st, 1972, he performed it at Milwaukee's Summerfest. The second he walked off stage, officers arrested him for violating obscenity laws. The charges were eventually dismissed, but Carlin would face 7 total arrests for that routine over the years. Every single time, he refused to back down. While his career was exploding, his personal life was imploding. In 1976, at the height of his fame, Carlin vanished from the stage for 5 years. The official reason? He'd suffered a heart attack. But that wasn't the whole story. His substance habits had gone from moderate to extreme during the 70s. When labelmate admitted there was so much of it available on Carlin's private jet that he suffered a relapse just being around it. Carlin was particularly into powder during this period, and it was wrecking his body. His marriage to Brenda was in ruins. Her drinking had gotten worse, and combined with Carlin's own issues, their home became a war zone. Kelly, now a preteen, was caught in the middle. She learned to read her parents' moods, recognize every hangover and withdrawal symptom, walk on eggshells just to keep peace. Sometimes she had to actively sober them up. She later described a family trip to Hawaii that turned into an absolute nightmare. George and Brenda started fighting because he wouldn't share his stash with her. The argument escalated into divorce threats and petty insults. And then it reached a point that still haunts Kelly. Both parents grabbed kitchen knives and turned them on each other, right in front of their 11-year-old daughter. Kelly stepped between them, partially stopping the confrontation, and made them sign a peace treaty. She begged them to stop using and fighting for the rest of the trip. It didn't even last a day. Things got worse when Carlin's mother came to stay. She spent her time insulting George while secretly pouring drink after drink for Brenda. The enabling pushed Brenda over the edge, and she ended up hospitalized for alcoholism. When she got out, she gave Carlin an ultimatum. She wouldn't come home until his mother was gone. Carlin made his choice. He booked his mother a flight back to New York, dropped her off at the airport, and told her exactly why. It was brutal, but it might have saved his marriage. After that, Carlin and Brenda started confronting their addictions. Their relationship improved significantly, but the damage had already been done, especially to Kelly. The 80s brought new opportunities. Carlin branched into acting with memorable roles in Outrageous Fortune, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and Shining Time Station, where he replaced Ringo Starr as Mr. Conductor, a bizarre fit for someone known for profanity-laced routines. Still, his body kept sending warnings. He suffered another heart attack in 1982 and yet another in 1991. But he refused to slow down. He kept performing, kept doing HBO specials, kept pushing himself, despite every sign telling him to stop. His comedy evolved in a darker direction. He started wearing all black, growing his hair into a long ponytail, and joking about violence, bombings, and beheadings. Some longtime fans thought he'd gone too far, that the bitterness had overtaken the brilliance. And soon, life started imitating his art in the worst way possible. In 1997, Brenda was diagnosed with liver cancer. She passed on May 11th, just one day before Carlin's birthday. After all the chaos, all the fighting, all the recovery, she was gone. Carlin was devastated. But 6 months later, something unexpected happened. He met celly writer Sally Wade, and the connection was instant. Love at first sight. But Carlin was terrified. He told her he needed to be alone for up to a year. Then he disappeared. 8 months passed. Wade assumed he moved on. Then, out of nowhere, Carlin called. He asked her out. They started dating, and just over a year after Brenda's death, they were married in a private ceremony. By the mid-90s, Carlin seemed to have everything.
a successful TV show, a retrospective hosted by Jon Stewart, a best-selling book, and roles in major films. But then he walked away from acting almost entirely and spent years grinding on the comedy circuit. People assumed he just loved stand-up. The truth was far less romantic. Carlin later admitted he owed massive amounts to the IRS. Because of his substance use issues, he'd neglected his business affairs and racked up enormous debt. He spent 18 to 20 years digging himself out, doing gig after gig just to pay what he owed. In the early 2000s, Carlin was headlining regularly in Las Vegas. One night at the MGM Grand in 2004, everything fell apart. The audience wasn't feeling his darker material about bombs and beheadings. Carlin, instead of pushing through, completely lost it. He started complaining on stage that he couldn't wait to leave Vegas and get back to where the real people were. Then he turned on the crowd, saying anyone who travels hundreds or thousands of miles to give money to a large corporation had questionable intelligence. He walked off stage and the fallout was immediate. The MGM Grand fired him. Then his representatives announced that Carlin had checked himself into rehab for pain medication addiction and alcohol misuse. That disastrous set wasn't just a bad night. It was a symptom of everything still eating away at him. In a 2005 show, Carlin told the audience he'd been sober for almost a year. In 2008, he gave a candid interview admitting his addictions while hinting that other substances had helped him through life. His heart problems returned with a vengeance. He had surgery in 2003 and another episode of heart failure in 2005. He was only in his 60s and his body was falling apart. One day backstage, he jokingly lifted his shirt to show his publicist the results of all his heart surgeries. The publicist said his chest looked like a science project. But Carlin kept going. He didn't know how to stop. In early June 2008, Carlin performed at the Orleans Hotel and Casino. It would be his last show. On June 22, 2008, his heart finally gave out. He died from a heart attack in Santa Monica, California at 71 years old. The comedy world was stunned, but Carlin was ready. In his will, he requested that his body be cremated and his ashes scattered at the fronts of the New York City nightclubs where he had started his career. A perfect tribute, and true to form, he insisted there be no funeral. Instead, he asked his wife Sally and daughter Kelly to host a small party at his home where friends and family could share stories about his life.